the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, just want to mention we've got a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, or maybe leave us a nice review on iTunes. But today, Taylor and I are extending a very machinic welcome to our guest, Sean Bowden, senior lecturer in philosophy at Deakin University and author of The Priority of Events, Deleuze's Logic of Sense. So, Sean, thanks so much for joining Taylor and I on the Happy Hour this week.
Thanks, Cooper. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be with you and chatting about Deleuze.
As a kind of broad note, I've been thinking about this a lot since we had Henry Summers Hall on. I called him Professor. He got mortified, right? Because in Britain, there's a whole different gradation of terminology to be used. Whereas I think in America, just if you've got your PhD or if you're sort of an adjunct or whatever, everyone's professor in my head. So is there the same kind of gradation, senior lecturer? And if I called you professor, would that be something of
a faux pas?
A faux pas, yeah.
Yeah, it's not quite right. We're probably closer to the UK system. So we have sort of entry-level position as lecturer and senior lecturer, associate professor, professor. I think that would be the same for Henry.
That's good to know, and but that's totally besides the point. Just I'd love to hear if you have any memories, anecdotes of your sort of first encounters with philosophy, what caught your interest. I know you double majored in philosophy and French, right? So do you want to tell us just a little bit about your interest in those subjects that obviously dovetailed into your becoming interested in the work of Deleuze?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't start out in philosophy. I didn't get into philosophy until a little bit later on, probably my mid-20s, I suppose. Okay. Started out doing law, in fact, and it wasn't really doing it for me. I took some time out of law. I studied a little audio engineering. I played in some very bad rock and roll bands.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah, and then decided I wanted to go back to university, started studying psychology and sociology. One of my sociology teachers, a professor, he was very much into Foucault and started to read some Foucault. I found Deleuze's work, Deleuze's book on Foucault, and that was a real eye-opener for me. And as a result of that, I picked up a lot more Deleuze. I started reading the Capitalism and Schizophrenia volumes as an undergrad, and then decided I wanted to finish off my studies in philosophy. We packed up my bags and moved down to Sydney to work with Paul Patton, who was at the university at that time. So obviously the translator of Difference and Repetition, but a number of other works as well. Yeah, and I've been stuck in philosophy and with Deleuze ever since, I guess. I guess my understanding of Deleuze has been refined somewhat over the years, but I remember being struck straight away just by the sense of freedom that I got from reading Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. I mean, I didn't understand a lot of the technical backgrounds to the books, but yeah, the basic kind of anti-foundationalist approach to things, the anti-essentialist approach to things, the idea that, we're creatures who have to invent ourselves experimentally, I think was really liberating for me as an undergrad. Yeah, and then I obviously started to read Deleuze's early work. I became obsessed for a number of years by Difference and Repetition and the Logic of Sense, and I've been stuck in these books for quite some time.
And there is a sense in which, does one ever know all of the nuts and bolts of these works, especially something like Capitalism, Schizophrenia? It is a kind of labyrinthine. You can follow the rabbit hole down, to use an Alice in Wonderland reference. You can follow the rabbit hole down, the breadcrumbs to all sorts of interesting avenues. And so I guess before delving into your book on the logic of sense, what exactly pulled you into that work in particular, if you had this interest in all of them? Was it, not to anticipate, but was some of this work influenced by James Williams? Because you mentioned he's one of the other, I'm not sure if there are any other books on logic of sense in English, at least, but I know that, Williams has a book on it as well.
Yeah, so I met James while I was studying for my PhD. I guess he was writing his book on the logic of sense at the same time as I was writing my thesis, and his book wasn't published until right at the end of my thesis, which was a shame. I would have liked to have lent a bit more heavily on it. But yeah, I don't know. I think we take slightly different approaches, though complementary approaches, to the logic of sense. At least in this, well, that was my thesis, the priority of events, and became the monograph. But there I was very concerned to excavate the sources of Deleuze's logic of sense.
Right.
James, though, and this is something James does very well, it takes a much more general look at the issues and is able to engage with the concepts in a way that's very conversational, that uses a lot of real-world examples and so on. And so, yeah, the books are quite different in their focus, but they complement each other as well in that respect. I think James's is more hands-on, has a more practical orientation, perhaps. Mine, though, was a little more theoretical.
Yeah, and you divided into 5 topics: the Stoics, Leibniz, Lautmann, and Simondon, which I appreciated. Structuralism, psychoanalysis. I'm wondering, you do give some background, and part of this is strategic, right? And as you said, theoretical. But was there, when you were drafting your thesis, was this just something that sort of made sense to you to break it up in that way? Or was this, I guess, what was the genesis behind it, if you can give a little bit of that thought process?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the time I was looking at it, and I think a lot of theses maybe start like this. You become interested in a book or in a topic, and you go looking around for literature on it, and not being able to find any, you decide, well, there's something that really needs to be written here, or I guess I need to write the book that I wish I had coming to this topic. So there was a little bit of that. In terms of how the book ended up being structured, I mean, the logic of sense is a very puzzling text, as you know.
Yes.
It's not composed of chapters, it's composed of series that have complex relations between one another. And, how do you take a broad overview of a text like that? Requires some restructuring. And I mean, I was reading around various other things at the time, and started to read a little bit of process philosophy, in particular, just sort of introductions to process philosophy. That's right. Where I was at the time. And yeah, it came to see that there's this basic distinction between, substance-oriented ontologies or metaphysics and process-oriented ones.
Right.
And it was a question, what comes first, I suppose, the substance that causes the change, or the change that brings about the thing? And, I came to realize that Deleuze's answer was that it's just changes all the way down.
Yeah.
And so, once I had this basic process philosophy framework, it then became a question I could ask. I had this question I could ask of each of the major thinkers Deleuze treats in that book. To what extent do these thinkers advance the kind of process philosophy that Deleuze is interested in? Aiming to get a process explanation of sense, events, language, thought, and so on, and ethics, of course, as well in the logic of sense.
Right.
So then, I had a rough structure for the book. He talks a lot about the Stoics, a lot about Leibniz, very long section on psychoanalysis, which takes up about a third of the book. What could each of these figures offer Deleuze's process philosophy of sense, events, language, ethics, and so on? And where do they fall short? What does Deleuze need to say on top of that in order to make it work? The book was structured in this way. So for example, the chapter on the Stoics, I went through into Stoic philosophy in quite a bit of detail.
Yes.
Showed what Deleuze took from it, but also where for Deleuze that the Stoics didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
So they ended up falling back into a kind of substance ontology to a certain extent. Well, okay, so the Stoics stop short. What else needs to be said? Or well, let's turn to Leibniz and see what Deleuze takes from Leibniz, and so on through the other figures. I mean, the logic of sense is a puzzle. It's a problem in the Deleuzean sense that, the reader can have an encounter with. They don't know what to do with it. And, they need to try and do something fairly creative to grasp the central problems, the central themes, and to try and make sense of them.
I really liked how you pointed out that not only did the Stoics fall back on, let's say, even after sort of complicating the Chronos Zeus substance-based, the sort of God-based model of what the mixture of bodies and whatever, they fall back into this kind of substance metaphysics, as you said. But Leibniz, even though he complicates this with his mathematical innovations, his metaphysical, his conceptual innovations, he seems to never have fallen back, but always presuppose a kind of transcendent principle of God working at the same time. So they kind of both have this dynamic view that, and yet still leaves this transcendent, this sort of anchoring, predetermining point, or I don't even say point, but this, this totality that Deleuze can't abide, right? There's something about, I don't want to call it Deleuze's atheism, if you will, but there is something presupposed, I think, in his, the affirmation of divergent series, the eternal return, if you want to be loose about it. Is there something about this in Deleuze's work? Because his atheism extends also to the unity of the self and the world. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about this you call it the process philosophy, where he wants to start with pre-individual singularities and not with some sort of guarantee above.
I mean, what's interesting in process philosophy is that Whitehead studies has survived mainly in theology departments, and there are a lot of theologians. There are a lot of theologians who are very interested in a kind of Whiteheadian God, God as process. And, I think there's some work there for theologians to get into Deleuze's work and try and understand or redescribe, a godlike form in terms of processes. And obviously, there's the connection with Spinoza there too.
Right.
Which is tantalizing, and some work can be done in this regard. And I do remember from one of Deleuze's seminars, and I'm really operating from a very sketchy memory here, but, Deleuze attributed, the creation of a lot of logic to theological thought as well, which was particularly interesting. So the starting point for Deleuze, being so influenced by Nietzsche in particular, is certainly not with a transcendent God or some set of first principles and so on and so forth. His starting point is really, I think, with, in the world, with the variety of encounters that we have, the complex experiences that we have, the complex situations and various structures that we find ourselves immersed in. And the question then becomes, well, what kind of philosophy can we elaborate on that basis? So, a very immanent conception of doing philosophy. And look, I think this obviously relates as well to Badiou's take on Deleuze. I mean, as we know, Badiou was accused Deleuze of advancing a kind of metaphysics of the one.
Yes.
Everything that there is just a moment of the one's productive power or something like that. And again, I think the starting point is all wrong there. And, if we start a little more imminently, then we see that, Deleuze has no need for the one. In fact, there's a sense in which, in fact, Deleuze and Badiou share a number of theses with regards to the nature of events, the nature of truth, the way in which events rupture with the structured situations in which we find ourselves and demand an open-ended transformation of those situations. And obviously, Deleuze is working in a particular tradition as well, which is moving away from philosophizing in terms of one's totalities and so on and so forth. He was very influenced by Jean Wahl in France, professor at the Sorbonne, who was the one who really introduced American pragmatism to the French philosophical scene. Wrote a wonderful book on pluralism and Anglo-American philosophy. Was a great promoter of James's work. And I think Deleuze was incredibly influenced by this as well. Certainly, there's a lot of stuff in the Hume book, for example, which recalls some of Wahl's theses about empiricism and James's particular treatment of empiricism as well. So all that to say, Deleuze was working in a tradition that took a kind of pluralistic philosophy and immanent philosophy very seriously.
You actually anticipated, I think, 2 or 3 of my questions. I'll circle back to them and we can go deeper. Before moving to, I guess, one more anecdotal question, I recall you also edited or perhaps co-edited a volume on Deleuze and Pragmatism, which I think Duffy published in. This is something that I haven't really delved into, but this biographical point about one of Deleuze's teachers sort of exposing him to the pragmatists, I think that's really interesting. And did you already have a sort of interest in that side of the pond, if you will, as well?
Yeah, I guess as a function of my undergraduate studies. So I was in an analytic department, essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, the University of Sydney at the time was an interesting place. There was a kind of divide, I guess, between the continentals, as it were, and the analytic philosophers. And in fact, just before I started there, they had 2 schools of philosophy. I can't remember what they were called exactly, but they were split along those geographical and philosophical lines.
Right.
Just before I arrived there, those 2 schools were merged into the one school of philosophy, but it certainly did have a strong analytic flavor to it. And a lot of the undergraduate units that I took were analytic in nature.
Yeah.
I didn't get a lot of pragmatism, but when I did start reading some of the pragmatists, I started to see some real connections between James in particular and Deleuze's work with their, treatments of experience. I became very interested, though, in some of the neo-pragmatists, the new pragmatists, like Rorty, like Robert Brandom, because I thought that, there was something in their work that resonated with Deleuze's treatment of language and sense in the logic of sense. Obviously, there are all kinds of divergences between the work of someone like Brandom and the work of someone like Deleuze, but I think, I found it useful to read Brandom to then try and clarify some stuff that's going on in Deleuze. They both cite Frege as a bit of an influence on their treatment of sense, and the way that Frege talks about sense and reference, for example, in direct contexts, was very influential for Brandom, and is a topic in the logic of sense.
Right.
So I guess I discovered the pragmatists fairly circuitously, although their work's germane given some of my analytic training as it were. I guess leaned on some of that work in order to clarify what's going on in Deleuze.
That actually makes a lot of sense, and I appreciated your section, or at least you unpack very quickly and clearly the way in which Frege's categories can map onto Deleuze's and the opening of logic of sense, and sort of you're able to connect those traditions in a way that I thought was nicely done. That you might sometimes see a book on Deleuze focus more on continental, but I like seeing this bringing in of the analytic side and sort of merging the two. Obviously, this is something that Badiou himself kind of does. He's able to allow for a kind of communication between the continental and the analytic, and in a certain sense, that divide is perhaps more of a shibboleth, if you will, and doesn't have to be as hard and fast. And the reason why I brought up Badiou again, I mean, you brought him up as well, and we mentioned before the show that you also edited with Simon Duffy the volume on, it's Badiou and philosophy.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to know about your time in Paris 8. I was very curious about this because Paris 8, obviously Deleuze didn't teach long enough for you to have taken a class with him, but after May 68, right, and Paris 8 is made, and there are these sort of restructurings of the university system. There's this whole political history that we won't necessarily go into, but it was kind of known for one of the more radical schools. I don't know if by the time you got there, it was the same way, but I saw that Badiou was involved with your dissertation to some extent.
Yeah, that's right. So I started my PhD at the University of New South Wales, and an opportunity came up to go to France for a year to do a degree that no longer exists. It's called the DEA, or DEA, the Diplôme d'études approfondies. It's a one-year master's, perhaps. There was some coursework and a small thesis there. So I went across, undertook this degree for a year, and while I was there, I was able to set up a co-tutel arrangement between the University of New South Wales and Paris 8, which allowed me, thankfully, to stay on in Paris for a few more years. Badiou was an emeritus professor at that stage, so he wasn't able to, look after my project administratively. So I had another wonderful philosopher who was at Paris 8 at the time, Stéphane Doyer, who I had a lot of contact with, but yes, had some contact with Badiou as well. Yeah, would go along. He still had his regular seminar, his monthly seminar at that stage at the École Normale. So I was able to attend that, which was wonderful. Didn't have too many supervisory meetings. He was a philosopher in great demand, as you can imagine. Every now and then he would have consultations with his supervised students, and you'd turn up, he'd be in his office for a couple of hours on a Friday or what have you. And if you didn't arrive hours in advance, you'd really stand no chance of getting in to see him because there'd be a line of students out the door waiting to talk to him.
That's great.
So we had a couple of brief meetings, but he was obviously, in the French system, it's a little different to the Australian system as far as examinations go. So in the Australian system, examiners always need to be external to the university for a PhD or an MA thesis.
I see.
Badiou as my supervisor, informal supervisor, I guess, was also one of my examiners for my PhD. So, yeah, I wrote my thesis in English. I had to have a long introduction in French at the front of the thesis, and then I had to sit the oral defense in French. Badiou was one of the examiners, asked me some wonderful and difficult questions about Lautmann, if I recall.
Oh, my God. Okay, great.
Which I struggled with for a while. But yeah, he was a very generous interlocutor at the examination, which was terrific. It was a great experience for me to go across, spend so much time in Paris, really experience a very different kind of intellectual culture to the one that we have in Australia. And had a wonderful opportunity to meet Badiou, talk philosophy with him, and to listen to his seminars.
That's wonderful. And you've already sort of answered the other question I was going to bring up. But I'm wondering, since you've already sort of knocked Badiou for this, because I see calling Deleuze a thinker of the one, it seems to completely overlook a lot of the fundamentals, which we can talk about later. But I'm wondering if I'm getting this right. I remember, and this could be an anecdote, where Badiou kind of translates his name etymologically, like Alain Badiou is like down with the old god. Am I making this up and misremembering this, or is there something to this? Have you heard this?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, Taylor.
I swear I've heard this. Maybe this was just an anecdote. Maybe someone's making a joke on my behalf. But Alain Badiou would be sort of like rendered roughly as down with the old god. And so it's his way of claiming this sort of title. He was born to embody the title of sort of bringing down the metaphysical one.
The thinker of the multiple. Yeah, so obviously after the publication of The Clamour of Being, a lot of Deleuzians were quite incensed, and there was some particularly aggressive reviews of the book. And I forget who the author was. It might have been Jose Gil.
Yeah, that's who it was.
Sort of accused Badiou of trying to bury Deleuze, which was, I thought a rather
hysterical,
exaggerated kind of claim. Certainly, though, The Clamour of Being is a difficult book. On the one hand, it really clarified for me a lot of, maybe not clarified for me what's going on in Deleuze, but it gave me access to aspects of Deleuze's thought that weren't previously available to me. So in that sense, it was a wonderful book. And, I know someone like, my colleague and friend John Rofe sees this book as a great work of philosophy, ultimately, quite mistaken about Deleuze, but nevertheless, a very interesting and worthy book of philosophy that manages to say something interesting, to say something challenging, and to move the debate forward. Yeah.
It's almost like a buggering of Deleuze in a Deleuzian vein, but maybe a little bit more polemical. But
it was pretty rough.
It's rough.
It was a bit of a rough buggering, that one. What's interesting about that book is you probably don't need to shift many of the theses, many of the claims, to see that, in fact, Badiou and Deleuze are so close on so many points.
Yeah.
So once I think where Badiou goes wrong is he obviously treats the virtual as a kind of self-sufficient domain.
Right.
The virtual is the cause of the actual, but the virtual is also the cause of itself, the cause of its own transformations, and so on. So it's in this respect that, the virtual is another name for the one.
I see.
According to Badiou's critique. But when we realize that for Deleuze, the virtual and the actual are two inseparable poles of reality, and that,
Right.
yes, sure, what happens to actual creatures needs to be explained in part with reference to the actualization of the virtual potentialities that they presuppose.
Right.
But at the same time, it's, actual creatures and their complex encounters and creative endeavors and so on and so forth. It's, what's going on in the actual that transforms the differential relations constitutive of the virtual. So these two aspects of reality are really inseparable. Once we can say that, I think that obviously it's fairly brief account there, but we see that Deleuze is not a thinker of the one; he's a thinker of the multiple,
or multiplicity, as he might call it. Right.
That's right, substantive multiplicity. And then each of the chapters in the Clamour of Being book, they treat all of those concepts that are so dear to Deleuze, event, truth, subject,
Right.
and so on. If we now go back and read Deleuze's theses about event, truth, and subject in light of this, rectified understanding of his ontology, we see that actually the two thinkers are really close. Yes, they do have different conceptual vocabularies, but ultimately, I do wonder whether these different conceptual vocabularies, when we see the conceptual convergences between the two thinkers on ontology of the multiple, on event, truth, and subject, whether the different conceptual vocabularies in which their claims about these topics are couched, even though these conceptual vocabularies are so different, I don't think those conceptual vocabularies are really differences that make a difference as far as the kind of practical orientations of the two projects. And that's a, kind of wild claim, and I'm sure, some of your listeners will think, need to say lots more there by way of justification.
No, I like it.
But yeah, this is something that, a thought that I've come to. I recently wrote with a colleague a short piece on Badiou's Deleuze for an upcoming collection.
Okay.
Just trying to recall the title now. It's for the Oxford Handbook of Modern French Philosophy, which will come out maybe next year. I'm not too sure. But yeah, which looks at the Badiou-Deleuze relationship and tries to make the claim in a little more detail than I've been able to do here that the two thinkers are actually really close to one another, and we just need to modify a little bit Badiou's reading of Deleuze.
It is interesting because the way that the book starts, if I remember, and it's been over a decade since I've read it, but he does kind of start with almost this anecdotal, somewhat charming, memory of their correspondence, and he almost seems to admit that they're kind of like sibling rivalry going on there, right? That he does kind of admit they're closest, even if as Deleuze's interest in calculus, I was interested in set theory algebra. Badiou makes these little fine distinctions, but I think you're right that there is something about the way in which one of the things I was thinking about before talking to you today, since I thought about Badiou in relation to seeing that he was one of your advisors, was how something like fidelity to the event in Badiou's sort of idea of subjects, and sort of this obviously has a mathematical way of talking about it in terms of generic multiplicities and sort of bringing this fidelity to bear in which events can affect the situation. And I was wondering, thinking about sort of your elaboration of whether it be the sage in the Stoic sense, or as Deleuze says elsewhere, I think in the series on the event, he talks about the actor sort of doubling the event in this abstract line and counter-actualizing it. I'm wondering if you can kind of see, even if they may not have, as you said, the same terminological view, that there are some elements where there's a small parallax going on, right? Where they do converge and diverge, but there's a lot of resonance, if you will, between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking about this notion of fidelity in Badiou, and I guess you were asking where we might find something like that in Deleuze, and you referenced the Stoics. I think that's
the sage,
right.
And in the series on the event, he talks about the god of Kronos and the actor as a contra-do, right, as this anti-god who doubles the event in a kind of taking it as an abstract line in order to counter-actualize it so as to make the event a part of their own event. And I was thinking about how that sounds a lot like fidelity, even if...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So this notion in the logic of sense of willing the event, I
Yes.
think that is, in general terms, that's Deleuze there talking about something very similar to what Badiou is talking about when he talks about fidelity to the event. I mean, in both cases, what they're saying, it becomes a kind of an ethics of the event, almost an ethical imperative.
Yeah.
Do not reduce what happens, the event here, the eruption, the rupture with the structured situation in which you find yourself. Do not try to reduce it or foreclose it in terms of what already exists.
Yes.
Show some fidelity to the event, or in Deleuze's terms, you yourself have to will the event. You have to become worthy of what happens. And
Yes.
you are faithful to the event for Badiou, and you are worthy of the event, or you become worthy of the event in Deleuze by transforming the structured situation in which you find yourself in an open-ended way in response to this event of rupture. For me, there are very strong similarities between those two ideas. And, it's sort of claims like this that led me to think that despite the very different conceptual vocabularies in which they're couched, the kind of practical bearing that these two philosophies can induce are very, very similar. And this is very clear, obviously, in relation to the ethical aspects of their philosophies. Ethics of fidelity for Badiou, the ethics of willing or becoming worthy of the event in Deleuze.
This is great because you've again anticipated something. I'll say this, and then I definitely want to let Cooper speak, because I always do this. I get a little excited. But you mentioned this, as he says something like ethics means this, or it has nothing to say, right? It's not to be unworthy of what happens to us. And there is a way in which we can become unworthy. And he even talks about this in Nietzschean philosophy in various ways, but it's obviously we can be resentful, right, of what happens to us. We can judge, we can bring faults, we can try to place blame. And we end up, as he might say, being bad players of the sort of the game of chance, right? We end up trying to be cheaters at the game, and we sort of we don't affirm the whole of chance, if you will, right? But we try to find blame for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Nietzsche's very strongly in the background there. Bergson's very strong in the background there as well, I think. So these methodological sections in the two introductions to the Creative Mind volume, where we find Introduction to Metaphysics and the Possible and the Real Essay and so on. And there, Deleuze makes a lot of these passages in the first chapter of his book on Bergson, of the Bergsonism book. So there for Bergson, essentially it boils down to this. What Bergson is saying is, sometimes we encounter problems for which our conceptual resources are just ill-suited. And that, great philosophy for Bergson is going to consist in the creation of new terms, new fluid concepts, as he calls them, in distinction from those frozen concepts that we tend to walk around with in our heads all the time. We need to create these new fluid concepts with which to pose and resolve new problems. And I think this is something that crops back up again in the logic of sense, and where Deleuze is talking about this notion of willing events, right? So we encounter something, we experience an event, there's a kind of rupture with the structured nature of our situation. How do we become worthy of it? Well, we become worthy of it by transforming the structure of our situation, including the structure of our thought, the way in which we think about things. And again, this is a theme that recurs continuously, I think, in Deleuze. And again, it's present in What is Philosophy, for example. The creation of philosophical concepts, Deleuze and Guattari want to say, happens as a function of problems. You create new philosophical concepts with which to pose and solve problems that are genuinely new. Nietzsche's in the background there, Bergson's in the background there. The Stoics, of course. So, the Stoics, their ethical imperative was, to live according to nature. This becomes a little transformed in the logic of sense. So it's not so much, live according to nature as, live according to the event which never ceases to come about. So the Stoics are in the background there. But then what's really interesting as well is that Deleuze talks about this notion of willing the event in relation to this French poet, surrealist poet, Bousquet.
Bousquet, yeah.
Yeah, which is
the wound I was born for, right? He says something like my wound pre-existed me. I was born to embody my wound. Right, yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah. So, it was how to become worthy of that very real event, absolutely transformative event for Bousquet. And of course, as a result of that, he was bedridden and incredible pain, was taking some fairly strong medication for the pain, and became incredibly prominent surrealist poet, and in his poetry, his wound is a constant theme. And he was able to, I think it might have been Alquier, he put it something like this, you have to say that no longer that Bousquet was wounded, but that Bousquet became his wound.
That's a Stoic way of putting it, kind of, right? Or maybe not. They would put it in the present tense, but go on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess, the other thing this little discussion suggests as well is just how difficult it is to read Deleuze's work. So, we've been talking about this little notion of willing the event here. And in order to grasp it in its full import, we've spoken about Nietzsche, we've spoken about Bergson, about the Stoics, and now about this poet Bousquet. I mean, and arguably in the background of all of this as well is Hegel.
Interesting.
They're diametrically opposed in this way. Towards the end of the Phenomenology, Hegel says something like, the wounds of spirit heal and leave no trace.
Right. Okay.
Whereas the wound for Deleuze is something that is always already open.
The wound is a map. It precedes the territory, something like this, right? But I was also thinking about he ends that series on the event after going through Bousquet. He ends it talking about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's collapse and how we can kind of find this resonance between a thinker or a writer and their illness, and that can kind of redefine style. And I'm wondering, in the background, not to be too biographical or psychological, but in 1968, Deleuze, he comes down with tuberculosis. He has to have surgery. He has one full lung removed, as well as a portion of it. I'm sure he was still a heavy smoker at the time anyway, because that was French life. But I'm wondering, in these lines, because he will continue this trope throughout his work, even up to the end with The Exhausted, where he is thinking through illness in such a, especially in Logic of Sense, you see it in other series too, but it's such a personal thing. I'm wondering if he's obviously very cognizant of his own illness.
I mean, it seems he would have to be, right? He was never very keen to discuss his philosophy in terms of his own biography.
Of course.
But it was, I guess, Deleuze was always searching for that point where the personal became impersonal, touched on the impersonal, because, that's where life is. I think you're absolutely right there. I guess, though, following Deleuze, I guess I wouldn't want to try and understand it. It's tempting to think that, Deleuze's biography is behind his interest in these themes, but I wouldn't want to try and reduce this.
Not at all.
Not that I'm suggesting that's what you're doing, Taylor, but I guess we should be careful about trying to reduce philosophy to a kind of intellectual biography. As interesting as that is, and as unavoidable as that is as well. I'm always reading little biographies of the thinkers that I'm engaged with. Read recently Sue Prideaux's wonderful biography of Nietzsche.
Okay.
I Am Dynamite, which is wonderful and really brings out. It really brings out a portrait of Nietzsche as, suffering not only physically, but psychologically.
Yeah.
And it really helps us appreciate all the more what Nietzsche, the human being, the philosopher, was able to overcome in order to advance this, incredible life-affirming philosophy. And no doubt, readers of Deleuze have the same sense. Knowing a little bit about Deleuze's biography, he was able to overcome incredible, physical problems and nevertheless advance a life-affirming philosophy that's free of resentment. Deleuze is true to his word here. I think he became someone who was worthy of the events that happened to him.
Exactly, and that's a really good point to bring. And Nietzsche, obviously, one of the things that always stuck out to me was how he writes about convalescence. I know that was something that Nietzsche, or that Deleuze himself, picked out in 1962 in his book on Nietzsche before his own, failing health. But this notion of convalescence as a sort of the way in which the body thinks from the perspective of health toward illness and vice versa, and how there is, this dynamic resonance between the two states that is also, to bring in Spinoza too, who had physical ailments from, grinding lenses. It's about cultivating joy and about how that can become potentially these passive, joyful affections can sort of take on or promote an active overflowing of life. There was no question there. Just riffing.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So, all of these thinkers, in a sense, there's a sense in which you can talk about them as, using illness to develop a new perspective on, what's ordinarily considered health, and through this new perspective to get a sense of what constitutes, what Nietzsche calls, and what Deleuze called, following Nietzsche, the great health. This is the point where, the personal, as it were, touches on the impersonal.
Coop, did you want to shut me up?
This question may wrap up the intensity a little bit, Sean. So if it's too much, you just let me know. But one of the things that I brought this up in our conversation with Simon Duffy, just in looking at the Leibniz, and just to maybe set the stage for you. So I have this idea that, in a sense, Leibniz is kind of like, he's schizophrenizing mathematics to a degree with his differential calculus, at least maybe reading that through Deleuze, I would say, perhaps. So one sort of connection that I'm drawing, I can't, maybe jump the last little gap to, would be how the Leibnizian singularities or monads sort of correspond to the partial objects, or zones of intensity rather, on the body without organs. I've got some quote from your text that I can pull up if you need a little bit of scaffolding to think about this, but I don't know if, does that strike you just immediately? Does that kind of jar? Does that kind of get your thoughts moving at all, or am I kind of off base here?
It's a really interesting question. Deleuze has a complex relationship with Leibniz. So I think of the book on Leibniz, on the Fold, for example. It's a wonderful work of scholarship on Leibniz and follows Leibniz very, very closely. I think Dan Smith put it like this somewhere, that, Deleuze wants to follow a philosopher as far as he can go, but also push that philosopher to the point where, something tips over into this differential philosophy that Deleuze himself is best known for. And, the book on Leibniz, The Fold, is an excellent example of this. Deleuze touches on everything from Leibniz's physics to his metaphysics to his theology to his practical philosophy even. It's only right at the end of the book that Deleuze says something along the lines of, but we're living in a kind of different world now. Following, I don't think he references Nietzsche there, but, taking seriously the kind of Nietzschean observation that God is dead. We no longer believe in God, and what this means is that the series are no longer organized in terms of convergences. We can no longer think of a single best of all possible worlds in the way that Leibniz did. The world that displays the most perfection and continuity. The world that's, conceived by God as the best possible amongst all the other possible worlds that are at least possible. But, they're not all compossible with each other. So, we no longer believe in God. God is dead. What are we left with? Well, we're left with, yes, sure, there are some convergent series there, but, we're left confronted by incompossible worlds. And the monad here, the singularity, is not something that is determined within a particular world of convergent series. The monad is something that is, Deleuze says, astride incompossible worlds. So, how does this relate to the notion of partial objects? I don't know. It's difficult to sort of jump quickly between these different kinds of conceptual vocabularies.
Yeah.
But certainly we get a sense in which, the object in question here is no longer something that could eventually find its place within a convergent series. So, the partial object is not something that is going to be able to be integrated into, a convergent world, a happy family with, fully integrated mother and father figures and well-adjusted infant and so on. The object itself is differential and is inseparable from its differential relations to other series of differences and so on and so forth, where, the problem of these differences is something that confronts the child. So, jumping now to a psychoanalytic kind of vocabulary, these incompossible worlds, these series of differences are something that confronts the child as a problem, and it's a problem that they themselves need to solve. And there's no predetermined endpoint. There's no predetermined solution to this problem of divergences. We can only solve these problems experimentally in this sort of groping and blind way. Interestingly, in The Logic of Sense, where Deleuze talks a lot about Leibniz in the middle of the book, I think it's around the 15th, 16th, and 17th series. There he tries to talk about a genesis of sense in a way that takes the God out of Leibniz's philosophy. What he notes, first of all, is, you have, first of all, the convergent series that is the world. We might say it's the habitual world, as it were. So, a world in which everything has its place, is related in determinate ways to other things, and so on. Of course, as individuals, we're also determined within this world. We do, however, and can encounter things which demand a kind of transcendence of this convergent world. Something emerges, Deleuze says, and again, following Leibniz in some respects, something emerges in between incompossible worlds. And we as thinkers need to think this object equals X, this paradoxical entity that's astride different incompossible worlds. And there, he's thinking about Leibniz's letters to Arnaud, which talk about, the different atoms in the different incompossible worlds and so on and so forth. In the end, Deleuze says, there's something that's common to incompossible worlds. And we as thinkers, we're tasked with thinking this paradoxical entity. And we can only think this paradoxical entity by transcending our particular determination within a given world and becoming something other than what we are, thinking differently to the way we currently think. And this, arguably, here Deleuze is setting up, as it were, the structural coordinates for the genesis of sense. And then later in the book, where he draws heavily on the vocabulary of psychoanalysis, not only Freud, but Lacan and is in the background as well, and Melanie Klein is dealt with explicitly. In this section, arguably, Deleuze wants to dynamize this account. So, Leibniz gives him the structural coordinates for the genesis of sense. In the psychoanalytic section, as it were, Deleuze dynamizes this account and, drawing on a psychoanalytic vocabulary, talks about the way in which, the infant in its psychogenesis confronts these problems of divergence, encounters things that just don't fit, and as it were, constrain the infant to look for solutions to their problems at these higher, more complex levels. So from domain of confused sensation through to the development of kind of imaginary responses to the problems encountered in the depths of bodies. The child tries to draw for itself these different parental imagos, these images which are supposed to integrate series of differences. But then, in this imaginary stage, again, another problem is encountered. The real father appears as the bearer of symbolic law. And again, that the child confronts a problem of divergence, between its imaginarily constructed world and, the world of symbolically governed social relations, for example. Again, you have this problem of incompossible worlds that demand some kind of resolution. So, the child needs to start engaging with the problem at this new higher level, at the level of at the symbolic level of language and culture. But again, what's different to the, perhaps the cliched psychoanalytic story is that there can never be a perfect resolution to these problems. These problems, for Deleuze, that's all we've got. We live our lives by encountering problems and trying to solve them in creative ways until one day, we'll encounter a problem that we cannot solve, and that'll be it.
Or it'll sort of, as you've kind of pointed out, this encounter is precisely that violence that shakes us up and forces us to think and find new ways to determine problems, right? Because it's always this question for Deleuze about we have the solutions we deserve based on how well the problem's determined. And I'm thinking about how, I believe it's in the 13th series. And by the way, I loved your bridging the gap between the Leibniz sections on the static ontological logical genesis and the dynamic sections at the end, because by the end of the logic of sense, I've always felt a little less confident than at the beginning. You kind of run out of steam, at least in my reading. So I really appreciated you going into that. But what I was thinking about how in the 13th series on the schizophrenic and the little girl, where we see sort of Carol giving way to Artaud, right? And where I think that's perhaps where he first mentions Artaud's sort of elaboration of the body without organs, right? And I think it's later in A Thousand Plateaus where he says something interesting where Deleuze and Guattari say, the body it's not against the organs, it's against the organization. And I'm thinking about how one of the key things that you bring out and that Deleuze hits upon in Diffus Repetition several times in Logic of Sense is that if we're forced to choose between an undifferentiated abyss or singularities that are already imprisoned in bodies, we're sort of in a double bind, and we can't be forced to have to choose. That in fact, I think for Deleuze, we have to sort of I forget how he kind of puts it, but we have to get to the point where we can sort of see this impersonal transcendental field where there is this nomadic distribution of singularities. And if we can't attain that, then in a certain sense, we're sort of stuck with what they might call an illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious, or whatever, if you want to use the terminology from Anti-Oedipus. I'm just kind of trying to tie some of these things together for to piggyback off of what you were saying in response to Cooper.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Obviously, the relationship between texts like The Logic of Sense and Anti-Oedipus, the question of that relation is a really interesting one. There have been some wonderful articles on it. Dan Smith's obviously treated the issue in depth. Yeah, look, obviously there's some transformations to the concept of the body without organs going on there. But
yes,
I mean, I guess what's interesting for me, some of the parallels between The Logic of Sense and Anti-Oedipus, for example. In The Logic of Sense, Deleuze is interested in what he calls the surface, right? The surface of the metaphysical surface of the event. And it's something that takes place between the depths of bodies with their intensive relations and so on and so forth, and the heights of conceptual language and thought. The event unfolds on the surface between these two dimensions.
Right.
Now, I wonder whether, it's often said that there's a kind of collapse of the surface in Anti-Oedipus, and all that we're left with, intensities that move and transform one another on a body without organs.
That's kind of how Dan puts it, right?
That's right. But there are these two related orders in Anti-Oedipus as well, right? We have desiring production on the one hand and social production on the other. And Deleuze and Guattari are quite clear that desiring production is always already social production.
Just different regimes, right?
That's right. And, obviously there are transformations between these regimes, right? These social formations change. They are always mixed. Obviously, Deleuze and Guattari make the point that, these regimes are always mixed. But nevertheless, there are changes taking place at the level of the social. And the only way we can talk about these changes, the way that Deleuze and Guattari want to make sense of these changes, is with reference to what's going on at the level of desiring production. And then, of course, you have this problem where social production, social formations, capture desiring production, channel it in structured ways such that the social is not something that's continually being transformed. We just have a reproduction of a given social formation all the time. But arguably, the ideal here is, again, to kind of occupy a surface between desiring production and social production. We can't help who we are, what we are, where we find ourselves in the middle, as it were, is in the middle of a social formation with its particular structures and so on and so forth. Desiring production is also something which is constitutive of who we are. The solutions to the problems that we encounter, again, I realize I'm sort of flipping between vocabulary. Yeah, I mean, just as in The Logic of Sense, so, we're called on to occupy this surface between the intensive depths of bodies and the heights of language and conceptual thought, and where we can only occupy this surface by transforming our language, our thought, and the way that we live.
Right.
So too we find something similar in a text like Anti-Oedipus. Arguably, we are lodged, as it were, between desiring production and social production.
Right.
And the solution to the problems that we encounter are going to demand a kind of transformation of those social formations that are constitutive of who we are. We need to find ways to, not get locked into social reproduction, to the reproduction of a particular social formation. That's no way to solve your problems. What's being demanded is desiring production, which is also always already social production and social transformation.
That actually dovetails back into the way that we were talking about the ethics of the event and fidelity to the event and sort of engagement with the situation in such a way as to forego ressentiment, or what Deleuze and Guattari might say, or maybe Foucault might say in the preface to Anti-Oedipus, is sort of to watch out for the cop in our head, the fascist in our heads and our hearts that can, what schizophrenia has processed can always kind of swing to that paranoid pole. There's always what they might say later. What would they say? Gosh, you can always sort of take deterritorialization too far, too fast, and sort of go on a suicidal line of flight. There's all different manners of saying this, but one of the things that, and I'll give this back to Coop, but I wanted to bandy this with you. One of the things I was thinking about was in this discussion of Leibniz, right, where Deleuze seems to be saying, okay, you work through the math of this. And we talked a little bit about this with Duffy, right, with Poincaré and the qualitative sort of differential, and you kind of walk us through how Deleuze gets there, but he tries to take the differential calculus and reinterpret Leibniz and push him, as you said, to a point of toppling him where convergence is no longer the main criterion, right, guaranteed by God, where in fact we can affirm the divergence of series. And I was wondering if this has some cachet with the notion of, would this be in the sense in which, for Leibniz, disjunction is exclusive, and that would give us to a kind of restricted disjunction where there's just a hard either or binary, right? That's the rule of compossibility. Whereas Deleuze is kind of saying at the level of the event, there is no compossibility. It's just at the level of sort of worlds. And so we can have an inclusive disjunction, right? Which would be, I think, for him, one of the criteria of at least that synthesis. So there's a sense in which the body without organs as pure multiplicity without, they don't say body without organs, but they say design production as multiplicity without unity. There's a sense of that's the affirmation of the inclusive disjunction. And that's the neo-Leibnizianism, or at least one aspect of it, I think, that you kind of bring out in your second chapter of your book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so obviously Deleuze takes Leibniz as far as he can. Ultimately, though, and as you mentioned, as we were talking about at the start, in the logic of sense, Deleuze sort of, how to put this in a nutshell, Deleuze needs to stop with a given thinker when they presuppose something substantial, when they
Gotcha.
fail to think the event all the way down, as it were, so processes all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
Leibniz is one of those thinkers who stops short with and introduces something substantial. And this is, Leibniz's God, who calculates and chooses from amongst all possible worlds, the best of all possible worlds. This is the only world that exists. So you either have this world or some other world that is incompossible with it. There's an exclusive disjunction between these worlds. With the collapse in the belief of God, there's no way we can affirm, that this is the best of all possible worlds. All we are confronted with are these problems of divergence. But, as Deleuze says, in compossibility, it's no longer a matter of exclusive disjunction. We can talk about an inclusive disjunction here, because these incompossible worlds, they constitute the structure of the problematic.
Right. Right.
This problematic transcendental field, which is, has a kind of metaphysical primacy over language, thought, and life. Now, where was I going with all this, Taylor?
You're maybe going to say that there is no God to guarantee the best of all possible organs for bodies, right? That would already lock singularities in a pre-given substantial body. And I think that maybe that's one interpretation of where Cooper's trying to think through this Leibnizian body without organs.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Let me speak for you, Coop.
This quote that I have up on screen, I think that to me, this is like almost as a definition of, I've kind of felt it was a definition of body without organs in this kind of Leibnizian way. I don't know if that would be useful, but if we think so, I'll read it.
Go ahead. We'll reflect and take a moment. You can.
Every body then has a dominant monad which is active in the sense examined above. Its concept explains more distinctly what happens in and for the monads composing its body. The dominated monads, for their part, represent this dominant monad confusedly or passively, but they in turn are dominant or active in relation to other monads, representing them clearly, and so on to infinity. The body, in this sense, not a substance, but a phenomenon resulting from simple substances, the reality of which is situated in the harmony of the perceivers with themselves at different times and with other perceivers. In other words, a body is an aggregate of substances, these latter being understood not as parts which make up a whole, but as the body's essential internal requisites. As Deleuze describes it, since all the individual monads express the totality of their world, although they express clearly only a select part, their bodies form mixtures and aggregates, variable associations with zones of clarity and obscurity. So to me, that was a good encapsulation of kind of how I sort of perceived the body without organs. I don't know if I'm onto anything, but is kind of the first thought that struck me. Oh my God, this is the body without organs. But
maybe the zones of clarity and obscurity, if they had some resonance with intensity, which becomes kind of the dominant catch-all phrase for the BWO and Anti-Oedipus, at least. But I don't know if you have any reflections on that, Sean, or
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd actually read that quote slightly differently.
Okay.
I mean, I take Deleuze there to be following Leibniz and talking about the way that individuals are constituted within a composable world, within a single world.
Okay.
So my constitutive events, as it were, have a law-like relation, a law-like expressive relation. The events that are constituted of me express the entirety of this composable world. Okay, so such that, the reason why an event can be truly attributed to me can be found in some other event in this world, and the reason for that event can be found in some other event, and so on and so forth, all the way to infinity within this composable world. So Deleuze takes this on, right, from Leibniz. In a sense, that describes perhaps what Deleuze would call in difference and repetition our actual world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is a world of determined individuals, in which things relate to one another in law-like ways, even though that's not a term that Deleuze uses. But the question then becomes, how does the individual transcend its particular individuation within this world? And it's at this point that we need to start talking about divergent worlds. Okay, so something appears for the individual within its world, which seems to belong to incompossible worlds. It seems to be in common to different possible worlds. Again, using this Leibnizian vocabulary. In other words, something emerges, or the individual encounters something which disrupts, which doesn't fit within the structured situation of its world. Okay. How does the individual think what it encounters, this problem? Well, it thinks it by transcending its world and, creating new modes of thought, creating new ways of living, making sense circulate, as Deleuze says, making this paradoxical entity circulate and transform, all of the different series of bodies, series of events, series of propositions, and so on and so forth. What I would say is that, at least this is my reading, and I understand, that there are probably perhaps some other perfectly legitimate readings as well. My sense, though, is that that particular quote doesn't really capture the body without organs. That quote captures the actual world, and that the body without organs is a world that, in the Leibnizian vocabulary, is made up of relations between divergent series, relations between incompossible worlds. These relations of incompossibility are taken up and transformed through the encounters that particular individuals have, and so on.
This is why you have to subtract God in order to think the body without organs, at least in an affirmative, inclusive sense.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So, there's nothing that guarantees the convergence of series here. We find these series, these series are constitutive of the structured situations in, which we live and think. We encounter things that don't quite fit. And, what we have to do is experimentally transform the structured nature of our situation in order to address the problems that we face. And it's an experimental process. There's no endpoint that can be defined. It's something that, it's, again, coming back to this idea that Deleuze is essentially a process philosopher. This is an ongoing and open-ended process of transformation.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this notion of the Kraken ion and the dissolved self, and how that might be the language of logic of sense in Deleuze's own terms outside of Artaud to think about this thing. But I was telling Coop, we discussed this before, how Deleuze says later on, it's okay to disagree with your interlocutors and people you're collaborating with. I mean, like Cooper and I, for example, we speculate wildly on these things, but Deleuze himself says that he and Guattari never quite could pin down an agreement on what the body without organs meant. So even within their duality and their way of working it out, they were, I think as Deleuze says in the preface of Difference Repetition, like, how does one write unless one is writing on the edge of one's knowledge, right? There is a sense in which if you already know everything, then why even write, except to perhaps perform some gesture of mastery or something like this, right?
Yeah. Look, that's exactly right. And I mean, what's interesting too in this discussion, and I think it's a problem that a lot of scholars working with Deleuze find, is we try and explain what's going on in Deleuze. We try and explain some particular concept with reference to some other set of concepts which themselves need to be explained. So
Right.
you move to some other conceptual vocabulary to explain that, and so on. And the process is never ending. And of course, Deleuze puts us in this situation because he only ever does philosophy in this indirect way.
Yeah.
He is putting forward his own philosophical claims, using the voice of Leibniz or Nietzsche or Artaud, whatever the case may be. Is there a way, a good question would be to ask, is there a way of stepping outside all of these conceptual vocabularies that Deleuze utilizes in order to talk about what's going on in Deleuze in this way that's, at a remove from the way Deleuze himself formulates his philosophical problems and tries to solve them? I don't know.
That's an interesting challenge, right?
Well, I guess all we can do is do a little bit more of what Deleuze is doing. We find ourselves in the middle, as it were, in a structured situation, which includes lots of philosophy. Yeah. And all we can do in relation to the problems that we encounter is to continue to transform this philosophy that we find ourselves, that this philosophy with which we engage, and which constitute us as contemporary philosophers.
Yeah. We try to take that abstract line and link it up to the neighborhood of other singularities and resonate those series. And I was also thinking about the fact the way that you were posing the question, which I think is a brilliant question, and it's a question very befitting of logic of sense, which is precisely that this series of concepts reminds me of the paradox of, the indefinite regression, right? Where you need a name to name the other name, and the only thing that can say its own sense that doesn't require something else is nonsense. And so perhaps body without organs is, in the end, we could say it's a nonsense, right? It says its own sense, and that
asignification. I mean, that kind of tracks.
Yeah, it's an asignifying sign that actually produces lots and lots of talk, because there is, if someone says, what the fuck is the body without organs? How much time do you have, right? Like, how many different stories do you want? This reminded me of a question, one of our followers on Twitter, because I was announcing, excited about our discussion and saying like, throw some questions at us. Let's see if they make it in. One of a great question, because it's so interestingly put, is what the fuck is a psychoanalytic novel, right? Because it's kind of how the preface begins. Hopefully, I think the edited translation with Konstantin Bunis may have fixed that mistranslation, right? It's not a psychological novel, it's a psychoanalytic novel. Did you ever ponder over what that provocative statement that Deleuze ends his preface with meant?
I'm sure I did. I'm struggling to recall what I might have made of it. It's a logical and psychoanalytic novel.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I mean, in a sense, it captures the two halves of the book, as it were. One dealing with the static logic of sense, as it were.
You've already answered this question.
Well, maybe.
No, well, not to interrupt you, I did, but you kind of answered this question by bridging Leibniz and psychoanalysis and this way of this question of surfaces. So I won't bemoan the point, but I always found that line, it's a logical and psychoanalytic novel. Maybe because Cooper and I, we come from English literature backgrounds, I'm always wondering what the novel meant, and if that perhaps is indicative.
It could be a pun.
Well, yes, but I was also thinking maybe it refers to the style of the work, right? The serial style, because the first novels were actually serials, maybe not the same kind of series, but they were,
right. Sure. It's a good question, and it's a detective, and there's something else in the preface too, right? It's a detective story. Mm-hmm. The clues, which help us unravel whatever's going on in a particular series, they can be found in some other series, and so on and so on. One thing that always struck me though is Deleuze. I think he claims explicitly, or at least it's implied, that you can read these series in any order. Because they relate to each other differentially, the idea is, right? So they only make sense in relation to each other, and because that's the case, you can read them in any order, as long as you read them all, I suppose. But I actually think this is really unhelpful.
I thought he said that about the plateaus, but does he also say that about the series?
I'm reasonably sure. I don't have my copy of The Logic of Sense.
Oh, that's okay. But go ahead. Go ahead. I don't think it's either.
Let's presume for the sake of argument that he says something like that, or at least suggests it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I actually think this is not true, or it's perhaps unhelpful. What I'd strongly suggest is reading The Logic of Sense from the first series all the way through to the end, then read the appendices as well, and then go back and start reading the series in different orders in order to make those connections. But don't start just by reading the series in a random order. Read them successively, because they do progressively develop particular ideas. It would be hard to make sense of what's going on in the third series of the proposition, for example, without having read the stuff about Stoic dualities in the series prior, for example. And of course, we get this progression where, we have the static genesis of sense in the first, 2/3 of the book, and then the dynamization of that account in the long psychoanalytic section of the book. So if Deleuze says, you can read these series in any order,
don't believe him.
I think that's a little bit unhelpful. Read them in order first and then go back and make of them what you can.
This actually kind of bridges to, because they use that trope in 1,000 Plateaus. You can read them in any order, but you should read the conclusion last. And I think that I would argue the same thing, that you might want to read 1,000 Plateaus all the way through, because they say it's like listening to a record, right? And so how do you know what's your favorite track until you've listened to it sort of as a concept album, if you will? And then you can sort of figure out what are the singles on it that you really like to riff off of and to remix. And I think that's sort of the same thing. And I was wondering if you feel like, I guess this gets back to my point about this being a novel in the sense of the serialism. I know that the serialism, if you will, that phraseology changes in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, but obviously Anti-Oedipus gets back to this strange book, and it's not experimental, at least stylistically, in the divisions of chapters. But in Plateaus, and you've got rhizomes. I'm wondering do you feel like the serial experiment in Logic of Sense, which is very creative for Deleuze's solo work, kind of there's a resonance in 1,000 Plateaus? I know we don't have series now, but we have plateaus, which are very kind of similar, because there's still these self-vibrating continuous regions of intensity that don't culminate. I mean, same way that series ramify. I'm wondering if you see something that gets transferred over to that project that lends to the creative feel of the composition of 1,000 Plateaus.
Yes, I do. And I think you're right. Obviously, the language of series disappears, mainly because Deleuze and Guattari are at pains to distance themselves from any structuralism project. But I think in both cases, what we have roughly is Logic of Sense and 1,000 Plateaus. We have the text as a problem that we as readers encounter, right? And this problem has a particular structure, for want of a better word. In other words, there's a relationship between the different parts of the book which is not linear, ultimately. Now, I'm saying that, the Logic of Sense should be read in a linear fashion, of course. I've just said that, so I don't want to contradict myself. I think it's useful pedagogically to read it in a linear fashion, but then to understand it, obviously, you need to reread it in a non-linear fashion where, you're using different parts of the book so perhaps later parts of the book to make sense of earlier parts and so on. But these two texts, confront the reader as a kind of non-linear problem in which the reader themselves is asked to do something. You're asked to solve a problem. And the only way to solve a problem is to make and experimentally transform connections between different parts of both books. To sort of put it in a nutshell.
I like that, because maybe if Deleuze thought of the Logic of Sense as non-linear, if it were a line, it'd be a Mobius strip, right? That he's kind of the way he talks about sense as the fourth dimension that unravels the circle of the other three. And it's, even if it's an unwound Mobius strip, it's more tortuous for all that. And he has that kind of he gets it from Borges, right? That the craziest labyrinth is the sort of infinite straight line of ion. Yeah. I know that getting into Simondon would be a whole nother episode, so I won't. And you've written on him, and I have a special place in my heart for him, for sort of toiling with him for almost a decade. Look, I will say, thanks, Taylor, for all your work on Simondon, and that translation is an absolute gift to the English-speaking philosophical world. So thank you for all your work on that. I liked how reading your translations in your book, I was saying, hey, that sounds a lot like the passages I remember. Well, obviously, I remember the introduction most, because it was already kind of famous, because it was pretty much the only thing available for a long time. But I was wondering just quickly, and this is a speculation because we are speculating here, if one of the things lacking in Badiou's appreciation of Deleuze, to give him a benefit of the doubt, was this missing link where instead of focusing so much on Lautmann, he perhaps did not focus enough on Simondon. Because I think that your elaboration of the way that Badiou kind of mischaracterizes the virtual seems to then also leave out any place for the pre-individual milieu. Again, that's just a wildly speculative thing of inside baseball, but I do think that the way that you brought together Lautmann and Simondon as he does in those two big footnotes in the 15th series on singularities. It's Simondon's got a new conception of the transcendental. Here's the 5 characteristics, and then he has that long footnote on Lautmann. And you brought them both together, in the middle of your book. I was thinking that perhaps Badiou doesn't appreciate or didn't really. Obviously, he has a special place for Lautmann, right? He says kind of how much he's indebted to him. But I've never seen Badiou refer to Simondon, and maybe that just wasn't his cup of tea.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd certainly range him on the side of the what does he call them? The vitalist mystics.
Okay.
But I think you're right. It's very interesting. I'm thinking about difference and repetition here. So if one of the issues that one could take with Badiou's characterization of Deleuze is that he, substantializes the virtual, that he separates out the virtual and the actual, whereas what we ought to be doing is understanding that the virtual and the actual are two inseparable aspects to reality, right? So, it's what happens in the actual, as it were, that accounts for the transformations of differences and so on and so forth taking place in the virtual, just as, the becoming of actual entities, depends on a transformation of the virtual differences they presuppose and so on. So these two aspects of reality are inseparable from one another. And Deleuze looks at them successively, right, in difference and repetition. In chapter 4,
and chapter 5, yeah.
And chapter 5. So in chapter 4, he develops his, sort of mathematical formal model of problematic ideas. And in chapter 5, he talks about the way in which these problematic ideas are actualized through intensive relations. And, what Deleuze makes clear in those two chapters is that, again, these two things are inseparable from one another. He says something in chapter 5 like, it's the intensities which are creative of actual entities which express virtual ideas and their transformations, right? So the idea here is, the virtual has no reality outside of actuality and the intensive transformations of that actuality. Okay, so you've got these two aspects to reality, tightly intertwined and affirmed as such in chapters 4 and 5 of Difference and Repetition. And it's not long after he talks about this that in chapter 5 of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze starts talking about Simondon and says, Simondon essentially talks about this in terms of the impersonal transcendental field.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's on the impersonal transcendental field that, as it were, the actual with its intensive transformations and the virtual relations and singularities all come together.
Yeah.
So I think that's right. And, so there might be something in what you say, had Badiou been more attentive not to Deleuze's treatment of mathematics, but to his treatment of Simondon, he might have been willing to say, that the actual and the virtual, they can't be separated out. They're inseparable aspects of reality. They mutually presuppose and transform each other.
It's the same as the notion of sense, sort of, it insists, but it doesn't exist outside of its expression, right? Or problems insist, and it's only through their expression that they find that their non-being, right, the question being, can sort of explicate into and sort of induce its effects. And I think that's he has 100 different ways of saying it, but it does seem kind of like selective reading on Badiou's part. But again, that's besides the point. When I was thinking about your discussion earlier, that point struck my head. I was like, that part he's missing is, if he would have just read your book, right, and the chapter on Lautmann and Simondon, he might have said, "Oh, okay, I see the connection there. Maybe he's not such a vitalist mystic." Yeah,
well, I'm not sure that's a claim I'd sort of put myself, but
I'll make it for you.
Yeah, look, I guess one thing I just would re-emphasize though is that ultimately I think Badiou got some of Deleuze wrong, but I still think Badiou is a terrific philosopher.
Yeah, of course.
He made me think about Deleuze in ways that I hadn't previously thought about Deleuze. So he does what all great philosophers do. He presents us with a challenging thought, something to be grappled with, something, to motivate us to transform the way we already think.
Yes, exactly.
Moving past our received notions to new points of view, new perspectives, which, hopefully are going to be better than the old ones.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it reminds me of, I resonated very much with Ray Brazier when he said that he was first drawn to Nietzsche, and he could have just stuck with Nietzsche forever because of the way in which there's that resonance. But sometimes I think Nietzsche himself said, if you want to follow me, you have to lose me, right? And I think that's part of it, that you can have a knee-jerk reaction to Badiou's Deleuze, but isn't it better to sort of, let's not be resentful, right? As you said, it's a challenge to thinking. And you're right. I think that Badiou is, he made me reinvestigate some of my own prejudices and misreadings. And I think that the best philosophers do that. Badiou does have a kind of more rough edge, acerbic, polemical tone. So you catch more flies with honey, but at the same time, you've also got a shock sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's an ethics of reading that I think you rightly point to there. Allow yourself to be challenged by a great work of philosophy. And yes, if it's a bit rough, then perhaps, that's all for the better sometimes. Be open to those jagged edges, make of them what you can. Yeah, we ought not to shut down these books by, dismissing them or, trying to reduce them to things we already understand. Yeah,
I agree.
We're doing some, as part of our undergraduate curriculum, bring some changes made at the moment, and I've just had to record a couple of videos to go in some of the new units in the Bachelor of Arts, and I kind of recommend for students. One of the questions I got asked was, what one piece of advice would you give to a student in the BA? And I was thinking, well, just do as many philosophy units as you can, but instead of, I said, I think what you should be doing is going out and allowing yourself to be exposed to things that are going to make you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
To things that are going to challenge you and, potentially make you think differently. Read philosophy, read literature, go to a gallery, look at great works of art, go watch a few experimental films, listen to some experimental music and so on and so forth. Be open to these things, let yourselves be challenged by these things, and it may not be relevant to your particular majors, whatever they happen to be, but they will make you into a better thinker, or at least they have the potential to make you into a better, more receptive, more nuanced thinker.
I like that. I think that's honestly great, and that might be a good way to end the show, but I just felt like it on such a positive note. What do you think, Cooper?
No, I agree. My other questions, we're going to take this on to wild tangents. So,
we had a lot of fun on. I love the wild tangent we went on, and but I really like that call. Sorry, Coop.
Well, I was just going to say, I had a way to kind of rehabilitate Leibniz in a sense. Very speculatively, would be through someone like Meillassoux, and what's the only necessary thing is contingency. So that would sort of what. The necessity of contingency, the implications of that mean that not everything is possible. So to connect that to incompossibility and his idea of the best of all possible worlds, right? In a sense, there could be some truth to that, because not all thing, due to contingency, not everything is possible. If everything were possible, that means that I think that implies that there has to be a certain conflict of interest between subjects or forces or what. I don't even know how to articulate that, but that was something that I thought of. I don't know if that is worth diving into at this point, but
it makes me think of the dice throw again, right?
Oh, yeah, good call. Yeah, exactly.
The ideal event, the
precisely.
Dice throw.
Yeah, for sure.
So roll the dice. A firm chance. I like that. But Sean, unless you if you want to respond to that or if you want to ruminate on it, perhaps
don't feel obligated.
You could reiterate what you're working on, or you can close with some of your future work or some of the problems you're encountering.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I think you put the point really well, Taylor, about the dice throw. And what came to mind too was, and it's not a book I've gone back to in recent times, but there's a French Leibniz scholar, Juliette Simondon, I should check that reference, but she wrote a book that took Leibniz in a different way. So she has a different starting point for her discussion of Leibniz. So she doesn't start with God.
Okay.
Normally, in an account of Leibniz, I know I did this in the book, you start with God. God conceives of all the possible worlds. Two things are compossible if they, are jointly realizable, and so on and so forth. And you go from God to the production of the best of all possible worlds. She, though, starts with the monad in the world. How does this monad, confronting various problems, and, she picks up in particular on the problem of evil, which is the subject of Leibniz's philosophy. So, the individual in its world has a problem, confronts evils. How can it make sense of them? And in particular, how can it make sense of these theological claims that it encounters as well, where God is all good, all powerful, all wise, and so on and so forth. And she engages in, what might be called a kind of form of universal jurisprudence, right? So it's the individual immersed in its world, encountering problems, which then, as it were, creates the concept of an all-powerful, all-wise, all-good God in such a way that they can, reconcile that, along with, using a number of other subsidiary claims, they can reconcile that conception of God with the world in which they live, with all of its various problems and so on and so forth. So a very different approach to talking about Leibniz, but one that's arguably germane to Deleuze's approach to philosophy. We begin in the middle, as it were, in our structured situation with all of these problems of divergence, and, we make of them what we can in our blind, groping, experimental ways. Yeah, so I don't know if that doesn't sort of directly address your question and comments, Cooper, but I think, it's related, and make of it what you will, I suppose. Look,
No, that's interesting.
In terms of what I'm working on at the moment, and thanks, Taylor, for asking that, I've been doing a lot of work on Deleuze, action and agency. So obviously I wanted to, I looked at the logic of sense. I want to talk about Deleuze's philosophy as a philosophy of events all the way down. It's a kind of process philosophy. But at some point, I actually found that difficult to reconcile, that kind of ontology or metaphysics of events. I found that difficult to reconcile with the idea that there can be a Deleuzean ethics or a Deleuzean politics, because ethics and politics presuppose agents who are capable of doing things, who are capable of action. And Deleuze's philosophy of events didn't seem to leave much room for action and agency. What happens is the result of encounters with events being transformed in event-like ways, and so on and so forth. So, this is a point that Hallward and others make. There are no genuine agents in Deleuze. All there are these intensive forces working through us, these virtual relations determining us to behave in particular ways. But obviously this can't be right. And, Deleuzean ethics, whether it's in the logic of sense, this notion of willing the event, or whether it's in terms of 1,000 Plateaus, where we find these ethical imperatives to make yourself a body without organs, or to de-stratify and what have you. This kind of ethics presupposes that there are agents capable of doing things for themselves in a certain respect. So what I've been working on recently is an account of action and agency in Deleuze that I can reconcile with his ontology, reconcile with his metaphysics, but also that doesn't fall back into any account of sovereign subjectivity. So I've been working on a kind of Deleuzean philosophy of action, for want of a better word. One that, against some trends in Deleuze scholarship, one that is contrary to the idea that there are no agents in Deleuze's philosophy, but also one that is very different to the accounts of action and agency we get in Anglo-American philosophy of action.
Interesting.
And I call it an expressive account of action and agency.
Yeah.
And obviously has a relationship to the way that Deleuze uses the concept of expression. But the idea is, so in Anglo-American philosophy of action, an action is explained, on the standard story of action, which, goes back to Donald Davidson. An action is explained with reference to the mental states of an agent. So they have an action is an event, and it has as its cause another event associated with the coming about of desires and beliefs in the mind of the agent, right? So the agent has these desires and beliefs which have representational content. I desire a cup of coffee. I have some beliefs about how to go about making myself a cup of coffee. And that representational state then causes me to act in the ways that are specified by that representational content.
Right.
But the problem with that account of agency is it actually can't account for a lot of actions that we undertake. We often seem to do things without having, a well-determined goal in mind, or without having, a clear understanding of how we could go about, doing whatever we have a vague sense of what we're trying to achieve. These are things like, writing a book, for example, or a journal article, making anything. In fact, the more general category is, I guess, trying to solve a badly structured problem. Or a badly structured problem is, we don't know what the end result is supposed to look like, and we don't know which particular means we're to use to solve that problem. You find badly structured problems in law, in architecture, in education, obviously in philosophy, and so on and so forth. And obviously people are acting in all of these domains, right? How can we talk about this? Well, I think we should actually hang on to a notion of intentions. So like the Anglo-American philosophers, I think we can distinguish between, events that just happen on the one hand and actions that are genuinely done. We distinguish between those two things by referring to a notion of intentions. Okay, so an event is an action if it's intentional, in some sense of intention. But then the whole question is, well, what is an intention? Now, we can't talk about intentions in order to cover these other action cases, solving badly structured problems and so on. We can't talk about intentions as these discrete mental entities, these discrete psychological entities, desires and beliefs which have representational content, because, clearly we engage in lots of actions where we can't represent to ourselves in advance what it is we're actually doing or how we're going about it. So we need to be able to talk about intentions another way. And I'm proposing to talk about intentions as expressed entities. So the basic claim is, and there are a lot of sort of elements to this conception, but the basic claim is intentions are the expressed of actions. So there's something about the action itself as it unfolds, as it progresses temporally, and as it unfolds in a particular structured situation, with its various norms and so on. There's something about the action itself which brings to light or makes manifest or actualizes the intention. And in fact, there's even a kind of reciprocal relationship between the two. It's certainly true that when we act, we can have very vague general intentions, so I want to write a book on this topic, but I've got no idea what that's going to look like or how to go about it. That very vague general intention is certainly going to constrain some of what I do, but it's actually in the temporal unfolding of actually writing the book. It's in this structured situation, which consists of all the literature that I need to read and, paradoxes and problems that I need to grapple with and so on and so forth. It's as my action progresses in time and in this situation that determines or specifies the content of my intention, such that, it's only once the thing is finished that I can step back and go, okay, that's what I was doing all along, but I could not have said in advance exactly what I was trying to do. So that's what I've been working on. I think it's reconcilable with Deleuze's philosophy of events. And I think it can solve, well, hopefully, it at least addresses some problems in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of action. And I should say too, I deal with accounts of action, or rather accounts of agency that have been proposed by some of the new materialists, for example, who draw heavily on Deleuze and, Latour and others. I don't think that account of agency is going to work either, for particular reasons. So what the new materialist wants to say is that, all we have are assemblages, and all the elements in a given assemblage is an agent in some respect.
Right.
Okay, in that it can bring about some kind of transformation. The problem with this kind of conception is that there seems to be a difference still between, or rather the new materialist is going to find it difficult to distinguish between things that just happen as a result of, a particular process of assemblage and things that are genuinely done in that assemblage. So, what would be an example? Let's say we're in a running race together, and I give you a push, and you run it, hit some other runner, and you trip over, and I go on to win the race, for example. Now, there's no doubt, right, on the new materialist account, you were the agent of that tripping over, right? I might have bumped you, but you were the thing that brought about, at least in some respect, the event of the tripping over and and me winning. But there's no sense in which you did that thing. Rather, I did it. I was the one who gave you a push,
Right.
made you hit the other runner, trip over, and so on and so forth. So we still need some way of distinguishing between, something that can cause an effect in virtue of what it undergoes and something that can cause an effect in virtue of what it does.
Right.
I don't think the new materialist can make that distinction. I don't think it's got the conceptual resources to make that distinction. So again, we're going to need to have some way of talking about the difference between things that happen and things that are done. The hope is that this conception of expressive agency can give us that distinction that we need.
What I like about this is it reminds me a little bit of your discussion of Galois progressive determination, but obviously outside of a mathematical context. It reminds me a little bit of the way that Simondon concludes his dissertation, talking about the sort of resonance of ethical acts. But it also reminds me a little bit of the example you gave in your discussion of the Stoics with, I believe it was Chrysippus, talking about sort of rolling the cylinder, right? And but obviously, I like that you're trying to draw attention and establish attention in a middle path or navigate the waters between an Anglo tradition and a sort of more current continental one, and sort of find that, especially in relation to Deleuze, because I do think that he has, not just in A Thousand Plateaus, but even in Logic of Sense and Different Repetition, he has some of these beautiful lines. He almost waxes most poetic when he's writing about freedom. And so I agree with you that there needs to be an account, I think, of agency in Deleuze, because I don't think it's necessarily, even if sort of as he's kind of following Basquet and he's kind of talking about not to be unworthy what happened to us, I think that there is something active in our not being unworthy, right? And I think that it's not just, this gets back to something that we've talked about with in relation to Spinoza. There may be a determinism of the will, but that the will isn't the only thing. There is still this negotiation of agency, of choice, freedom of choice, freedom of agency, whereby there still has to be an activity by which we come to say amor fati, or we come to declare this love of fate. But fate in a Deleuzian sense, it's not necessarily fate in the Stoic sense, because I don't think he's a full-on Stoic in the sense in which you're either harmonizing with nature or you're not. You're sort of already in the mix of things, kind of like the way Simondon talks about, like, if you're not already syntonic with the tension of the mind, you're not going to reach it by incremental levels for the Stoics. You're either a wise man or you're not, right? You're already harmonized or you're not. And I think that Deleuze, like Simondon, has a different theory of ethical acts. So I'm really excited to hear more about this in the future. And honestly, I had such a good time with you, Sean. We'd love to have you back sometime next year when you feel ready to troubleshoot these ideas more with us and bounce them off of us.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll come back gladly. I've really enjoyed our chat today, Taylor and Cooper. Yeah, thanks again for the invitation. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a terrific way for me to spend a Sunday morning.
Oh, nice.
well, we'll let you enjoy the rest of your day. And honestly, we really appreciate you. And it's always a pleasure meeting new people, but you in particular, this was a singular encounter as always. And I really do want to thank you as well. And we'll stay on here to sort of debrief and wrap up, but we can let you sign off.
Once again, thanks to Sean Bowden for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is against the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
with nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.